Okay, and I'll send you obviously this on the YouTube link, and I will send you the original PowerPoint as well. So yes, it's recording fine. So session 1, management in procurement and supply for the advanced diploma. So there are 4 learning outcomes within the main section 1, and the first one is just explain the main aspects of organisational behaviour. The behaviour of people, the process of management, the organisation context, organisational metaphors, which is quite an interesting viewpoint, the psychological contract, and interactions with the external environment. So if you have to talk about influences on organisation behaviour or aspects, this is your answer. Definition of organisation behaviour, the study and understanding of individual and group behaviour and patterns of structure in order to help improve organisation performance and effectiveness. And that's from the textbook that we talked about earlier from Mullins. It's from the 2005 edition, but it's the same definition in his later work. So you need to learn a definition there, pretty straightforward. What are organisations, systems, people? And they have to work together, so there's this interaction. People are part of systems, and systems need to work with other systems. Mullins from the textbook gives us this framework for understanding organisations. So the nature of the purpose of the organisation is impacted by people, management, the context, and you can see the environmental influences feeding in there. And we've got processes and improved processes. So that framework there is in my study notes, and it's quite a good revision aid for the main aspects that we're going to cover on this course. So the syllabus talks about influences in organisational behaviour as the individual, the group, and the external environment. So there's a small slide here on the individual because we go into it in much more detail on section 2. So individuals are central to the study. Organisations are made up of individual members, but conflict can arise if the needs and demands of the individual are incompatible. So recruitment and selection, very important, and training and development and teamwork. We need to get individuals to work together, and the task of management is to integrate all these individuals to reach organisational goals. So they aren't working separately, they're working to contribute to organisational goals. So the group itself, which we're going to go into teamwork in much more in section 3, groups are essential for the organisation to work. Groups can be both informal or formal, and often develop their own hierarchies and leaders, and they influence individual behaviour. So managerial understanding of group processes can help the task of integration, which is the function of management. So we need to understand groups, we need to understand group dynamics, group processes. We need to understand the individuals, because individuals have needs, the groups have needs, and of course very famously Adair said the task have needs, so you need to consider the team, the task, and the individual. The organisation impacts upon organisational behaviour, the structure. It establishes relationships, it provides order, and it helps to direct the company towards goals. So organisational design can have an impact on the behaviour of people. And that behaviour can be good or bad, so if the organisation isn't designed properly, it can have a negative impact on performance and people. So getting the right structure, very, very important in organisations. The environment, of course, is a big impact because of technological development, economics such as Brexit, social and cultural influences, government, and the broader social responsibility and ethical behaviour. So we need to also, as part of management, assess the opportunities and risks posed by the environment. So that's fairly common sense. What is management? The process of getting results by making the best use of available resources. Provide direction. A social process. So there's 3 definitions there. I think probably only one is all you'd need. I'm not sure if my favourite definition is here. It could be on the next slide. But it's basically getting others to do the things you want them to do and not doing it yourself. It's not probably the best definition, but if you're managing, you're getting people to carry out activities that you're sort of supervising. One of the very early theories from management came from Fayol, and in 1949 Fayol said management is about planning, organising, commanding, coordinating and controlling. As I call it, POCC, P-O-C-C-C. It's very easy to remember if you remember it as POCC. So 5 functions. So yeah, I've seen that in books before, that's fairly. The word commanding now is not used. The later theories tend to use the leading word for coordinating and commanding, so it often gets replaced by...
Sounds ash.
Sorry?
Commanding sounds very ash, like the scientific method.
It does, and it sounds very authoritarian, doesn't it? That you're telling people what to do.
Yeah.
As opposed to, yeah, so it is very scientific management-y. It's part of the old classical school, and scientific management is part of the classical school. So it is pretty much as its year thinks. It's a bit of a dated view, really, of management, but it was an early view. Leading and managing, I've put a couple of slides here just to distinguish it. Leading is about deciding direction, and it comes from the Anglo-Saxon word meaning road or path ahead, knowing the next step and taking it others with you, so you need followers. Managing, though, is a later concept from Latin, and it comes from the word manus, meaning hand or more associated with handling a machine. So leading, a broader term than managing, and I think most of us probably understand that. Mintzberg actually sort of disagreed with Fayol, saying no, managers don't have functions, managers have roles, and some of them roles could be being a leader, could be a monitor. So there's 3 broad roles here on the left: interpersonal roles, informational roles and decisional roles, and they can be split into different parts. So you can see on the right hand side we've got negotiator. At times a manager needs to negotiate, they need to allocate resources. So this is important. This is looking at managers as fulfilling roles as opposed to functions. So it's an important theory, is Mintzberg, and it's one you'll come across a few times. It's not named on your syllabus, so they can't ask you about it, but they could ask you about the role and influence of management. So you think, not that easy, but we'll see. So Mullins gives us a lovely diagram that says management, though, is essentially making the company work by integrating everything together. So it's about the individual, the group, the organisation, the environment, and making everything work by creating the right climate, by satisfying the needs of people to achieve the goals. So management is the cornerstone of organisational effectiveness. So on this unit, if the organisation isn't effective, it's a management problem. But it could be because the structure's not right. It could be because you haven't got the work groups right, you've hired the wrong individuals, or there's something going on in the outside world that's causing you problems. So fairly straightforward stuff. Why do we need leaders? Energise, support change, commitment, set direction, support, challenge, facilitate, empower. But remember, this unit is about management, not leadership. It's just an overview of leadership as part of a manager's job that you need to be aware of. Where I go back to,
you mean structure control performance?
It's like having bosses and procedures to make the company operate. So you've got authority to maybe buy something, but to do something else, you'll report to your boss manager at work. So by having a structure and roles, particularly job titles, you know, as the director, you know, as the team leader. So having a proper structure and authority and clear roles that your job is to do that, but somebody else's job in HR is to do something else. So having a proper structure helps the company perform. But if the structure's wrong, the company may not perform. So the structure is all the systems, the job titles, the number of people at each layer. It's the whole setup, if you like, is the structure. So it's a big thing. So it's not. So it is about, are we tall? Are we flat? Is there lots of layers of management? Span of control. How empowered are we in the company? Can we make decisions, or do we have to ask our boss everything? So structure is a huge aspect on this, Yabu. So there's objectives and there's peoples. What else? This is quite nice. Morgan, which is in the Mullins textbook, said, no, you can think of companies in terms of images. So if you get a mental image of a company, it can help you understand how they might work. Some companies can be viewed as machines, some as organisms, some as brains, some as political systems, and I've got an explanation on the next slide of these. Or organisations as cultures, psychic prisons, flux and transformation, or instruments of domination. And we can see there the 8 are expanded there. So all theories of organisation and management are based on implicit images or metaphors that persuade us to see, understand and imagine situations in particular ways. The metaphors create insight, but they also distort. They do have strengths, but they can also have limitations. Hence there is no single metaphor that gives all-purpose point of view. There can be no correct theory for structuring everything we do. You think, oh, maybe. And that's a little more explanation, that you might get a case study where the company might be quite sort of bureaucratic and machine-like, where it's focused on efficiency, quality, timeliness. But you could also have a company that's more seen as probably brain, where effectives of information processing, problem solving and learning are based on cognitive characteristics of people. So there are 8 sort of different viewpoints on how you can describe a company. I'm just trying to think there. Yeah, there's a little more on it here. So companies often adapt quite well, so you could say they're organic. You could think of the company as a terminator, which isn't one of the recognised 8 from the other slides, but if you thought it was a terminator, they'd be a highly intelligent machine, in the sense they can find ways to kill the target. What kind of terminator do you need? This is just a little bit of fun, if you like, but quite frightening, looking at views of the terminator. So images of organisations, seeing them as brains, are learning loops. Organisations, unlike machines, can evaluate and target determined by their boss. Double loop learning. Companies are considered a broken one from the machinery perspective, because a machine have only to do what is ordered. A machine may not only determine its targets but just follow orders. Now, I would suggest that you watch the video on these metaphors, which I'll send you through the link, Yabu, on this. It's a bit abstract, but it's quite a nice way of thinking about a company. Can you describe them using a metaphor? They've only ever asked this twice. Not an easy question. It's only been asked twice. I don't think it's going to come up again because it's a very difficult concept. But if you have a look at this, and we can redo this next week, metaphors and stuff, it's quite a broad one. I'm just reluctant to drop out into the PowerPoint that's got the notes on underneath there. I'm just looking here if I can find my Mullins textbook, and it seems to have vanished now. I was going to see if I could see that, but Mullins gives a very good explanation of this. So they're metaphors. Carrying on from the metaphors, you can see bureaucracy being a machine, and Weber is the bureaucracy man, which we're going to cover in a minute. Right, slightly different thing. I don't know if have you heard of this concept called a psychological contract. So very important. You've done contracts where you've got implied and express terms. So some terms are written down, some terms are not written down. Now the psychological contract is your contract of employment, but it's all the things that aren't written down. So it's the implicit things that form part of your contract. So they aren't written down, but there's an understanding from you that the company will behave to you in a certain way, and there's an understanding from the company that you will behave in a certain way.
So psychological contract is like implicit contract.
Yes, that you're going to come to work and try your best and do all this, but you expect the company to be fair to you, develop you, reward you, treat you fairly. And if they don't do that, the psychological contract gets broken, and it can lead to a breakdown in relationships and job performance. So if you don't feel you won't feel committed to the company if they don't honour their side. So it's a perception from the two parties of what their mutual obligations are. So it's not written down. These are often informal and imprecise, and can be inferred from actions or what has happened in the past. For example, during recruitment or in performance appraisals, some obligations may be seen as promises and others as expectations. Let's give some examples here. So what are your obligations to your company? Work diligently, comply with policies, respect authority, uphold the values and image of the company, and behave ethically. So it may be written down, may not, but that's your term. So you've got obligations, they have, but it's unwritten, as you quite rightly said. It's the implicit things that are in your contract. It's been asked a couple of times. It's a nice, easy topic, I think. Thanks there. Yeah, I'm just getting a refreshment there. So yeah, so that's possibly new to you, was it, that, Boo? Is that the first time you've seen that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I've put together a video on that, which is on my recommended video list. So if you go down through section 1 when I send you it, I've picked out a selected video. There's one on metaphors. There's one on this employer psychological contract. And so I would probably advise you to have a look through them, because they certainly help. So that's worth looking at. So you've got...
The social and environmental factors has staple in it.
As what, sorry?
The social and environmental factors is the one that has staple in it.
Yes, yeah. So STEEPLE has obviously also got technological, political. So it's all the STEEPLE framework. So if we look on the next slide there, we've got here societal influences and cultural influences there, which are part of the STEEPLE. But on 1.1 it mentions just external influences. So in 1.1 there are general influences, and in 1.2 here we've named them as societal and the wider environment and cultural. And they've asked many, many questions on culture. So we're back to the individual and the group and the organisation. We've already looked at that slide on individuals. That's the same slide as I've got in 1.1 because the headings repeat. That's the same slide for the group that we looked at a short while ago. We've done the organisational slide, but there are more reasons here why we form companies, organisations, for social reasons, to enlarge the abilities, increase productivity, to accumulate knowledge, information, as in universities, and to facilitate efficiencies. If we didn't need them, we wouldn't form them, so obviously they fulfil a purpose. So organisations all have different purposes. They all have different structures, which should define the work roles, the tasks, information flows, the coordinate, the control. So fairly general stuff, not an easy list to learn, but I think most people understand what would be in a structure and why we have a structure.
Making profit is that not part of why we?
I would say making profits, I think, Yabu, is probably more of an aim or objective than the purpose of having a structure.
Okay.
But so private sector structures are to make profits, but you could say public sector structures are to give you value for money and social. So probably just a subtle difference there. It is subtle, isn't it? There isn't much. What influences structure? Well, just as you hinted there, Yabu, the objectives or mission. So if you're trying to make profit, your company structure will be different than if you're a charity. So what's the business trying to do? Technology, where you are in the world, how spread out you are, how big the company is. If you're a little company, you don't need 65 departments and managers. The environment and the culture. I've worked at companies with very strange cultures, and those have been the more traditional companies where the owner has formed the business and it's run by people who are probably descendants of the owner, and you get some very strange culture. So everything affects structure. Objectives, tasks, technology, fairly straightforward. Right, here's a very difficult concept. Mintzberg said you can think of organisation structures in terms of 5 components. And you think, oh, that's odd. There's a strategic apex, there's a middle, there's an operating core, there's a staff support, and there's this thing called technostructure. And what he's saying is you can describe companies in terms of these 5 components. Some have very little of one, lots of the other. Some don't have them all. And you think, that's difficult. So what are the 5 things? Well, there's a bit more there. Pretty obvious. Operating is the employees who do the work. The strategic apex is the top level managers. And in some companies, a small company, there may be only one guy at the top or person who makes all the decisions. Some companies have a big techno structure, some don't. Some have lots of support staff, some have big middle lines, some don't. So there are 5 areas that, and if you look at the structures that Mintzberg went on to say, so Mintzberg said there are 5 components, and then he actually said, unfortunately from your point of view, Yabu, there are 5 forms of companies. You can say it's quite a simple structure, which is usually a small business. The structure is centralised, autocratic, power from the top, typically control from the chief executive with small teams. Perhaps due to simplicity, the structure can be flexible, with strongly defined sense of mission. However, Mintzberg warns the simple structure is vulnerable because one heart attack, a bit cruel, can wipe out the company's coordinating mechanism. And then there's a bureaucracy, a professional bureaucracy, a divisionalised structure which has got much more middle management, and then there's this very strange thing called an adhocracy. It's a task or project based and has to respond quickly to changing demands. So again, fairly abstract stuff. Most of my students hate this because they think, do we have to learn it, Dave? Well, there's probably one chance in 30 it will come up, and it's usually only part of an answer. And so it's not that easy, but it links to culture. How the company's structured will influence culture, and it will influence performance. Now, you can't possibly remember those structures with one session, but you can see there's quite a distinction there. My study notes make it, I think, much clearer, Yabu, if you refer to that. But that's
What's the difference between machine bureaucracy and professional bureaucracy?
Yeah, I think the professional bureaucracy would be more your accountants and lawyers, and I think your machine one is more formalised procedures in a general sort of company. So I'm just looking here. Relies on robust technostructure. Planners and financial controllers are influential, leading to creation of multi-layers of management. It sounds very much like the public sector to me. Due to high degree of standardisation, tasks performed by the operating core can be rigid. So it's quite a bureaucratic, formalised structure, but it's not made up of, influenced by professionals. So I would say this is your general bureaucratic public sector as a sweeping statement. Not easy though, are they? They're quite difficult concepts, I think. But it's one, once you've looked at it a couple of times, you think, yeah, I can see that. But not named on your structure, remember? So they will not be asking you about that, but it could be part of a good answer. But some of this you might think, no, if it's not going to ask it, I'll only have background knowledge. So bear that in mind. What's happening in companies nowadays? Well, they get leaner, flatter, more project, more horizontal, less boundaries, more beanbags, which I hate.
Yes, I've been meaning to ask this question. What is horizontal structure? Is it the one that everybody will be on the same level?
Yeah, so there's less. It's like your open office and your boss, your MD sat behind you and everyone's sort of equal. So there's no boundaries. So very similar to boundaryless structures, horizontal.
This horizontal structure is usually talking about like sitting arrangements.
Like who, sorry?
It's talking about sitting arrangements.
Well, seating and authority, that the boss doesn't have a better office than you, and there isn't many people, or if any people above you, you're all classed as equal. So it's a very team-based sort of structure. But companies still have layers, but generally companies nowadays have less layers. I've worked at companies that have 10 layers, but nowadays you're lucky if there's 2. There's usually the senior management team, the management team, and that's it in a lot of companies, isn't there? So we have the SMT where I work now. The SMT is the senior management team. Then we have managers who aren't part of the senior management team. And then we might have team leaders. So there are many developments, and we're still recording good. Inter-organisational network structures. So how do organisations work together? Well, they can work through markets. Separate firms act independently but form temporary relationships, as in procurement. And hierarchies are organisation forms of single structured entity, which most companies are hierarchies. You can have virtual organisations, very trendy, and virtual obviously haven't got a physical.
Okay, like the one that people are in different sites, different places, environments, and they can.
Yeah, so it could be like home working. Everyone's not necessarily in an office, but the company does exist, but they aren't physically in one big building, which is very trendy. So virtual organisation, and obviously linked to this in section 3, we look at the problems of managing virtual teams. So obviously it's a bit easy when the team's with you in the same room, but when the team is halfway around the world, it can take some managing. And you're reliant on technology, and there are other problems that you might have different cultures, different time zones. It can be very difficult to manage. As we found out with Skype, it doesn't take much to go wrong. So virtual companies, important. There are different organisational forms that have developed over the years, and we've got here some quite complex differences here from the Mailer book, where you've got the classical period, the modern period, and post-modern. And the metaphors, classical is a machine, modern's more of an open system, and postmodern can be more thought of as a flexible tool. Structures from rigid to decentralised to not important at all. Focus internally was classical. Modern can be more human relations. Postmodern can be more about adaptability. Production focus, and then moving on there, organisation, human resources, and certainly where I work now, I'm sure where you work, full-time jobs for life have gone. People are on fixed-term contracts, people are even self-employed. It's changed. Now they can't really ask you to compare classical, modern and postmodern. It's just a useful couple of slides there to give you how sort of thinking has changed from the classical school right through to where we are now, most postmodern viewpoint. The environment obviously affects companies, technology, economics, culture, CSR. So fairly easy if that came up. That you need to assess your external risks, do your opportunities threats by doing a STEEPLE analysis. So all them things will impact on how you manage your company. And certainly, a bit like Brexit, if we leave Brexit, some companies might change physically where their companies are located. And that's because of a development in the external environment. They might set up offices in France or Germany because of the changes. They might not. Ethical issues can be at macro, corporate and individual. This slide is one from the level 4 units, which you'll have seen before. And then we've got social responsibility. It might be better if we called it sustainability now, but very important.
Sorry, maybe.
Yeah.
You said CSR is now called sustainability.
Yeah, I think loosely it is. In most companies now, they probably don't have a corporate social responsibility report. They'll probably call it sustainability. The term gets used interchangeably. Strictly, it's slightly different, but from point of view of CIPS, sustainability incorporates same considerations. It's looking at social and environmental as well as economic. So it's your triple bottom line. It's about being a good employee. But CSR from this unit is more about internal. You know, are you a good place to work at? Are you an employer of choice? Rather than dealing with suppliers, this is more what do we need to do as part of our social responsibility as a company. But it is used interchangeably now, you bear with CSR. I prefer the term CSR than sustainability. Very strictly, what everybody does on CSR contributes to sustainability. They are slightly different things. But if you look at the reports now, if you go onto the big websites of your Morrisons and Next and Gap and some of the big banks, from what they used to call their annual CSR report, they'll now probably call it their annual sustainability report. But within that are the same headings that they had before. They've just renamed it. But if you think you've done that before, haven't you? Sustainability, triple bottom line.
I think so.
Yeah.
I still can remember that.
Yeah, it was the people, planet, profit. Or strict. Okay, we'll just go back to the triple bottom line for a second. Elkington, when they talked about the triple bottom line, said it's no good just focusing on profits, finance. Companies need to also consider their social and environmental bottom line. Hence it's called the triple bottom line. Instead of just looking at the profits, companies should be judged on how good they are on managing social and environmental aspects. So that's the triple bottom line, meaning the bottom line in business is usually just profits. The triple bottom line recognises it's more than profits.
It's like a scorecard as well.
Yes, yeah, it's looking at a range of measures. Yes, it is scorecard. So don't just judge it on finances, judge it on other factors as well. And obviously you probably wouldn't go and work for a company that you didn't feel was ethical or a company that was going to treat you fairly. So it's very, very important is CSR for companies, especially with the image. It can destroy. Culture. Culture, there's lots of things you can see with culture, but there are many things hidden that are hard to see. Values and beliefs and assumptions you've sort of made aware as you work there, but they aren't strictly, you can't walk into a company and see them. You can just feel them, and for how people behave you can sense what they are. You should have done this on the negotiation yearboo that Hofstede talked about cultures, power distance, uncertainty, individualism, masculinity and long-term orientation. I don't
remember.
Right, so if I can just put this into a box, Hofstede developed a theory of international cultures. So if the question is about international cultures, it's this theory from Hofstede. If you go to his website, Hofstede, he gives these dimensions, and you can look at different countries and how they rate on each of these dimensions, and you'll see the Chinese come out quite different than the Americans. So his website's very good, and perhaps I'll put that up on the next session. It's worth having 10 minutes on. But Hofstede in his research said different cultures can have different perspectives on power distance. They can have different perspective on uncertainty. So we could cynically say, and I'm being cynical here, Germans like rules, they like certainty, whereas Latin American people maybe don't like rules and they're quite happy with ambiguous situations. Some companies all about personal gain and power and making money, the Americans. Some might be more collectivist, we, the Chinese, Confucian. Masculinity, social gender roles, and how long-term oriented we are. Not easy, but if we look at the next slide, I've done a slight extension there of that slide. You've got the 5 dimensions there and how it can be different. So Hofstede should have been done on level 4 negotiation, but depending who your tutors were. So, but it's international culture, not organisational culture. But obviously if the company is based in Malaysia, the culture might be influenced by the country. And again, I've got a very good video on the video readings yearboo on that. It's a lot to take in, isn't it, on this session, is that?
It is.
It is. It's actually, if you look at Mullins as well, it's widely discredited as being putting people into boxes and you shouldn't do it. And it's, I don't like the theory, but CIPS do. And it's in many textbooks. I don't think you can say everyone in China is like this, everyone in America's like that. It's too putting people into, putting labels on them. And there is some limitations with this theory, but CIPS like it, but it's international cultures. And obviously if you've got an international company or you're recruiting and you've got international employees, their cultures can affect behaviour and feelings. There is another model here which I don't want to dwell on from Trumpenaar, which has got 7 dimensions, and you really don't need to learn that. You do need to learn Hofstede's, but Trompenaar is another model of international culture. And they're the particular elements of Trompenaar. And again, I'll go past Trompenaar because I'm going to be very certain for you that you don't learn that. So what does cultures mean to us? Well, it means we have to manage cross cultures. We need to understand, because it can affect teamwork, communication, participation, conflict resolution and international issues. So it's very important that we get cross-cultural training, that we've got cross-cultural awareness. One of my favourite theories of cultures is this one from Johnson and Scholes. A much better theory than, and this is about companies, not international. Johnson and Scholes say, well, culture's to do with your systems, control systems, the stories that are in the company, what's gone on in the past, symbols like company car parks, staff canteens, directors' canteens, power structures, the actual structure of the company, the rituals and rules. So there are 6 elements of the cultural web here, which make up culture. And all these things affect the culture. And if you're going to change the culture, you have to change these 6 things to change the culture. Maybe, I'll just flick to the next one. I'll tell you why. Handy or Harrison came up with 4 different types of cultures, which are power, role, task and person. And these are perhaps the easy ones to learn for organisations. You don't need 2. So the international, I'm saying learn Hofstede. And I think for the organisation cultures, you either learn Handy's 4 types, or you learn the one on the previous slide, Yabu, which was the cultural web, which you'll come across next year, but you'll also come across Handy's 4 cultures. So the 4 cultures are here: power, where there's power centred in a key figure, control through personal communication, but little rules. Dictator, somebody in charge, they make all the decisions, they set the rules. Right through to role, bureaucracy, very formalised. Task, team-based, horizontal. And person, where it serves the interest of individuals, management function supportive rather than directive. So you've got, in your case study, you might have features of any of this, and they might ask you to identify features of the organisation culture. So you might say, well, it's quite a role culture here because it's bureaucratic. They've got very formal lines of authority. There's lots of rules and procedures, so therefore it's a role culture. Pretty boring. The power culture is probably not the best one. And then you've got task and person. And again, is that new to you, Boo? Can you remember any of that from the negotiation one?
No.
Sorry about that. There's a lot of new stuff. But again, we've got a couple of nice clips on the videos which you might just want to look at for 10 minutes before the next session. And we don't expect you to remember all this in one session, you Boo, so don't worry. But if we throw lots at you, then you can pick out what you might want to just watch a couple of clips on, read up about, and then we can go over it again next week. Because we'll probably go over this twice. Let me just have a look at this. So 1.3 then, we're nearly there. There's 1.3 and 1.4. So what's the classical view of companies? What's scientific management, which you've done before?
David?
Yeah.
Can we take a 15 minutes break, please?
Yes, we can. And let me freeze this here up here. Pause recording. Can you hear that? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great stuff. Great stuff. I've just pressed record again, yeah. Okay. I think you'll be a bit happy with this. It's much more straightforward. So classical, scientific management, bureaucracy and human relations. Very, very heavily examined as 1.3. So sometimes they can be called schools of management or approaches to management. And CIPS suggests the different approaches or schools can include classical human relations, including neo-human relations, which just means new, systems and contingency. So here's one from the Mullins textbook, which gives us a nice overview of how approaches to structural management have developed over time. So we've got the first sort of theories, approaches, classical, which going back to the 20s, formal structure, hierarchies, HR, Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne experiments, social factors, groups, leadership, moving on to systems theory, looking at that we need to consider the inputs, outputs and the social and technical systems that need to work together. And of course we've got the famous contingency theory, which says there is no one best design. It depends on the situation, the context, everything. So the form, structure, management depend on a range of variables. So that's a nice slide, that giving you a giving you a good overview of the 4 main approaches, and all those are on your unit content. So the classical school, which is the early school, looked at companies in terms of why do we have a company, what's the purpose, what's the structure, how do we plan work, what are the technical requirements, and it's based on rational behaviour to try and determine the most effective structure. So it's quite a scientific approach. Circular one, sorry, it hasn't shown the circular one there, that you start with planning and go around and go round and round. So yes, it is sort of linear or circular. Fayol also came up with 14 principles of management, that there needs to be division of work, clear authority, clear.
There's so many people bringing out their own theories.
I know, there's a lot. So there's 14 principles there, and now we've got a split in classical, that the original classical school can perhaps thought of as scientific management, Taylor, or perhaps as bureaucracy, as described by Max Weber. So they're subgroups of the classical approach, which are on your syllabus. Scientific management obviously was a long while ago when Taylor first developed it, and he believed in the best way of doing a job, and that paying a fair day's work, but you need to scientifically analyse the job, break it into tasks, find the best way, and people will be motivated because they are rational economic animals, and the underlying premise of scientific management is that money, if you pay people fairly, they'll work hard for the money. So it didn't consider the human relations side. Features, a division between management and workers, a science rather than guessing, work study, redesigning jobs, and scientifically selecting and training workers. So if you needed big people, you employed big people, but you also trained people. So a very scientific approach. The principles: develop a true science, scientific selection, cooperate with workers, you need structures, authority, close supervision, otherwise they might not work, and you need to divide work into managers and workers. So, okay, critique, lots of critiques, caused problems, workers were hostile, creates a lot of control, it's quite rigid, and it can lead to dissatisfaction. Workers as individuals just seen as machines rather than social animals. So there's a lot of critique of Taylorism. But what's his legacy? Well, we've still got work study, payment by results, you could say, is scientific management, management by exception, production control, proper training. So it was Taylor shaped the first coherent school of thought with the application to the industrialised world. So it isn't all bad. There are good aspects of Taylor. So in similar schools, so part of the classical school is bureaucracy, and Weber did studies where he developed the concept from sociological studies and his belief in the superior of an organisation structure which can survive changes in individual personnel. So the company should go on if it's organised properly, no matter who leaves, who dies, who comes and goes. The company will exist and survive, and they do that through having systems and procedures. It produces rationality, and it emphasises expertise and discipline. That's okay so far. What are the characteristics? Tasks are allocated as duties, clear-cut division of labour, very specialised tasks, division of labour, uniformity of decisions by rules, regulations, and I'm sure we've all worked at bureaucratic firms, impersonal behaviour by officials, so not very concerned about people's feelings. Employment is based purely on how qualified you are for the job, so there's no sort of personality aspect. It is just, have you got the qualifications, can you do the job? So the features, to summarise the previous slide, are specialisation, hierarchy, rules, and fairly impersonal behaviour. It's just a cold machine that gets on with running the company. Weber, again, general characteristics. I think this is repeated, sorry. Hierarchy, specialisation, rules, impersonality, rationality, uniformity, technical ability, and stability.
And there's no difference between the two then?
Between?
The scientific one and this one?
Yeah, there is. This is more how to set the company up, where Taylor's a bit more how to design the task.
Okay.
And they're both part of classical. But this one is a little more about how you manage the company. The other one, scientific management, is a bit more about how you manage the job. So,
okay, operation. Operation.
So Taylor's pretty much stopwatch. Weber's pretty much rules and regulations. So how do we overcome the problems of bureaucracy? Well, we might need to have less layers, so we downsize. We maybe delegate more. Don't have such rigid specialists, have more people who can do more than one task. Better communication in different directions. Rather than up and down, you would have communication horizontally. More emphasis on customer service, more customer facing, quality. So we can do things to sort of get rid of bureaucracy, get our beanbag in. Critique of bureaucratic, too much rules, too much emphasis on status and rituals. Individual initiative can be stifled by the rules. They can't adapt quickly, and their rigidity can restrict the psychological growth of members. So there are problems. There are advantages, but there are many problems. Flexibility, slow decision making, innovation, silo mentality, and inhibited sharing knowledge, which is pretty much the same as the other slide. So moving on from the classical school, we had Elton Mayo and his famous experiments where the human relations school was born, which grew out of the classical approach, which was quite mechanistic, and it was expected that this is from an examiner's report. Mark's management approach would be evaluated in terms of positives and negatives. So that's based on an examiner's report where it asked you to consider Mark's approach to management. And I can't remember whether he was taking a classical approach or a human relations approach, but basically to appraise the approach, you have to look at benefits and disadvantages. It looks like it was human relations because the explanation could have referred to it being people focused, developed mainly in relation to the dehumanising aspects of the original classical approach, theories and concepts which could be used with the work of Mayo, Hawthorne, Maslow, Hertzberg and McGregor. And we look at Maslow, Hertzberg and McGregor in section 2. This is just on a general overview of human relations. So it was Mayo's work at the Western Electric Company who realised social factors were very important, and informal groups and relationships.
David?
Yep.
When we did this, that Elton Mayo's work,
Yep.
it was between 1927 to 1932.
Yes, that was his research. That was just when he was born, the 1880s and 1949. So his work at the Western Electric was over that, was it 7 or 9 year period? The dates that you just said, Yabu. So
Yes.
His studies were, where did you say, about 1920?
1927 to 1932.
Yeah, that's right. So you don't need to know his age. I think it's more important that fact that you quoted when he did his studies. So I would go with that. So the Hawthorne electric experiments were, as you said, between 1922, was it, and 37?
27.
27, yeah.
32.
So that's a good day.
Work is different from that one.
The Hawthorne,
His research here is different from the 1927 to 19. He talked about the effects and something.
yeah. So his conclusions came out of them studies at the company, and it took him 9 years to work out what was going on. So the human relations approach is the findings of Elton Mayo. So what did he find? Well, he found that informal groups and personal relationships were important. But there are some critiques of the Hawthorne experiments. They aren't going to ask you to critique it, but it's perhaps oversimplification. And there is perhaps a diversity issue that on sex power differential, which we needn't go into, but it was the sort of men interviewing the women, and men generally were in charge. So perhaps there was some bias and perhaps some influence there. We don't know, but it wasn't a perfect experiment. So what's the legacy? What did we get out of it? Social needs, recognition of the work organisation is not just a company, but a social organisation, and group values and norms, very, very important. Whereas the classical school was companies without people, and you can think of it, human relations school, about people without companies. So it's a different focus, is the human relations. Moving on then from, let's check the slides working, yeah, from the HR approach is the systems approach, which is trying to bring together the classical and the HR approach, and it looks at the total company, the relationship between structure and behaviour, variables, and it sees the company as an open system with inputs and outputs that are affected by the external world. And this system developed as a result of the Tavistock Institute studies in the 1940s in the mining industry, where they recognised there was a need to consider both the social and technical systems that need to work together for the management to work. It was no good looking at them separately. So they recognised in a lot of companies technology systems were going to influence work behaviour, and that you need to take that into account. So systems is fairly straightforward, inputs and outputs, and contingency theory is, as it says, the best approach is contingent upon the situation. So it depends upon the task, the environment, the culture of the company, and that's pretty much the contingent approach. Decision making approach, achievement of goals by decision making, focuses on information, decisions, conflicts, is a decision making approach. Right, we've got this very difficult concept now of postmodernism. The study guide cops out on this one in that it talks about a postmodern organisation. Strictly speaking, the syllabus says postmodernism, which is a very difficult concept to understand, and it's a way of looking at the world that rejects attempts to build systematic explanations of history and society, which instead concentrates on the ways which human beings invent their worlds, especially through the language or discourse. Who said that? Watson. And we can see a fuller picture from Mullins here, that there was a classical approach which includes bureaucracy and scientific management. Then there was the human relations approach. Then we've got the systems approach.
Can you make it bolder, please?
I can't on this, but because I'd have to drop out the recording, you boo. Sorry, but I'll send you this. I'll send you the original PowerPoint as well.
Okay.
And then we've got postmodernism, which I think we'll revisit next week because it's very unusual concept. And it's basically saying you can't have a rational company that will cope with the outside world because everything's uncertain, and we can't have rules and regulations because of the uncertainty in the world and everything that's going on. So it's a different way of running a company because the world's complex. We need flexible structures, we need less rules, less boundaries, we need to encourage people to take risks. So we need a different form of company. It was in one of the slides going back about 20 that listed the difference from a classical company to a modern company to a postmodern company. There was a slide of 2 slides, Yabu, that gave you the differences, and I would suggest you look at my notes on that, and we'll have another discussion on that next week. So why do we need organisation theory? To help provide a setting to view management. It traces lines of arguments from different writers. It offers a framework to compare principles. It helps companies analyse a problem. And it enables managers to select ideas from a wide range of approaches. But of course the difficulty is which theory, but we do need to understand organisation theories so that we can all this on the slide. Caveats: the various approaches represent a progression, they aren't competing. Categorisations can be arbitrary. There may be general acceptance of the need for a framework in theory, but none exists on its shape of the framework. The distinction between the schools of management, classical human relations though, is rarely clear or accurate. So even though we try to put them in boxes, there is quite a lot of overlap. Culture is important, we mentioned that earlier. The tacit assumptions behind this is principles may be discovered without reference to culture. So culture important. What are the benefits to the manager? Helps explain complexities, provides comparisons. So there are some benefits there. It's your different view that work is the opportunity to engage in social relationships with a core sense of solidarity with the work group. It means you get this sense of belonging as part of a group, that you're not just in a company, that you've got this orientation that you're part of a team, as opposed to bureaucratic where you just feel you're part of a company and you're just a number on a payroll. So there's a sort of different orientation there, but some people just see work as a means to an end. They just go to get money and go home. They don't get any social interaction and benefit, whereas we maybe go to get a bit of self-fulfillment, not just to pay for the mortgage. So different orientations, different how you view why you go to work. And then we've got the final bullet, which is about new approaches, which we've partly mentioned: postmodernism, contingency, systems, and socio-technological systems. So there was a couple of slides on the earlier that went into this. We've got the schools there, from classical to contingency, and this section's about systems and contingency. Systems approach is recognising there's inputs, outputs, but there are many systems that interlink. So Mullins' viewpoint is these are the 5 most important subsystems, sort of. So how does the systems approach help? It helps us understand companies are dynamic, that there isn't just one big system, there are subsystems that must work together. There are interrelationships between the company and the systems. It focuses attention on this and the external environment. If you go back to that slide, there was the external environment at the top. And it helps integrate the insights of the classical approach and the HR approach. So it's a development on classical and human relations. It tries to bring them together, recognising all the different elements. Companies can be organic, typified by cultural fluidity, contributive culture, skill sharing, could be network, flexible, where they're focused on goals and outputs and not processes. So that can be and then we've got the contingency approach, which rejects that you can have one set structure that's best. So each company needs to be different and companies need to change, and the design of the company depends on the task and the outside world. Fairly common sense. Contingency management, as opposed to contingency design of a company, is saying there is no one best style of managing. It depends on your own style, the time, the task, and the individual. So there is not one appropriate style, it's contingent upon the situation. And then we've got this very difficult concept again, which I think the slide repeated, apologies, Postmodernism, which is probably worth us coming back to next week. I've read up several times on postmodernism, and I don't think I completely understand it, if I'm honest. I can learn my notes, I could pass the exam, but it's a very difficult concept. And if you look in the book, it doesn't really explain it. It sidetracks it and talks about the post-modern society. So the study guide goes down this: the postmodern company, not postmodernism. That to have a company that to cope with complexity, you need multi-direction information flows, boundaries that are rigid. You might need to get rid of layers of management. You need to empower staff. It's a bit googly, everyone getting on bags and doing what they want, and cultural tolerance of ambiguity. So you don't need rules, regulations. So it's a different concept.
Does it exist?
Take risks, yeah.
Does it exist?
Does it exist? No, that's a good question. I think the nearest in my mind is Google. If you do the YouTube Google culture, and it shows you how loose they are with their rules and systems, it's probably the nearest, I think. But no, most companies couldn't cope with it. It's textbook rubbish, isn't it? If I'm being very cynical, you boo. So no, I'm not a fan of it. It's a different